Momonosuke knew he shouldn't be here. The foreigner's harbour was no place for a child, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. Now, hiding behind a barrel, he watched the southern barbarians disembarking large crates from their large black ship. He wondered what they could be bringing. Silk, no doubt, he thought, and maybe some of those new weapons they call guns. Gods, he wished he could have one of those, but Momonosuke couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed while looking at the strange men. They looked and talked funny, that much was true, but where were the horns and the raven-like noses the others had told him about? He kept observing them, trying at least to find a horned one among them, until he heard the voices of his friends calling him to play stick fights. The arrival of the Europeans in Japan in the mid-16th century heralded the beginning of a new era for the land of the rising sun. Today we will look into Japan's relations with the Western powers, both on its own turf as well as on European soil. This video is made available for free thanks to our YouTube members and patrons. We fund our free content through our program of exclusive videos made for our members and patrons, who get 2 documentaries per week not available to the public. We've got a growing collection featuring the First Punic War, the history of Prussia, the Italian Unification Wars, and a review of the classic text Xenophon's Anabasis. We're now covering the Russo-Japanese War and Albigensian Crusades, not to mention our massive Pacific War week-by-week coverage, and a massive pool of other projects. All this is made for and with generous donations from our backers, so if you're enjoying our content and want to see more and support the cause of history, consider becoming a YouTube member or patron. You'll also get early access to public content, a spot in our lively Discord server, and behind-the-scenes info and goodies. We rely on our backers to support our growing team pumping out these videos, so thank you to everyone already involved, and we hope you'll consider joining in too. This is a very large island, 1,500 miles from the continent. Gold is very abundant, and no man being allowed to export, while no merchant goes thence to the mainland, the people accumulate a vast amount. Marco Polo. When the first Europeans arrived on the islands that Marco Polo had described as Zipangu more than 200 years earlier, they did not find the mythical land of gold and pearls the Venetian merchant had described in his books. They did find, however, a land that was rich in silver and, more importantly, willing to trade it. In 1543, 2 Portuguese sailors, Antonio de Morta and Francisco Zemoto, using Chinese guides and ships, arrived on the island of Tanegashima, just south of Kyushu. They were the first Europeans to have ever set foot in Japan, and their arrival would forever change the land of the rising sun. This was not only the beginning of Japan's foreign relations with the West, but also the introduction of matchlock firearms in samurai warfare. Portuguese arquebuses fascinated the Japanese, and the samurai, as keen warriors, were quick to acknowledge their value on the battlefield. However, firearms, while an important new technology for the Japanese, did not constitute a large portion of their trade with the West, as within only 1 year they learned to replicate the mechanism and began producing their own rifles. The Tanegashima Teppo, as they came to be known from the island that introduced them to the rest of Japan, became so popular that within half a century, Japanese blacksmiths were producing more arquebuses than their European counterparts. Instead, the Japanese market hungered for Chinese silk and porcelain, as well as exotic luxury goods, wine, musk, horse breeds like the Arabian, textiles and dyes, and European artifacts such as clocks, glass trinkets, swords, and even armor. From the Jesuit missionary Louis Foix, we are informed that Oda Nobunaga, a powerful daimyo of the era, was often gifted European and Indian-made clothes from his subjects who wanted to get on his good side, and that his chests were overflowing with such treasures. We can't be certain if he dressed in them often, if at all, but such items were undoubtedly expensive, and even if not to a lord's personal taste, they were still considered status symbols and demonstrated a daimyo's wealth and power over the others. On the other hand, Europeans were fascinated by Japanese lacquerware and weapons, which, as exotic items, were also used to elevate the prestige of their owners. Of course, for the Portuguese merchants, there was also much more immediate profit in the forms of silver and copper. For Portuguese traders, Japan was a honeypot. Not only did they monopolize trade relations with the island nation for more than half a century, but they also got to act as the middleman between China and Japan after the former had issued an embargo on the latter due to the piratical activities of the wako. But there was also one more aspect of the Portuguese trade in Japan that we haven't touched on yet, and it would prove to be catalytic to the island's future: the slave trade. The slave trade in Japan was not as large as the transatlantic or trans-Saharan slave trade. Nevertheless, Japanese men and women were sold off by the hundreds, either as a result of their capture during a war or because their families couldn't afford to sustain them. The slave traders would, in turn, sell them to buyers in Southeast Asia, India, or even Europe, where they would serve as laborers, guards, and concubines. While profitable, the enslavement of Japanese subjects was actually driving a stake between the Portuguese and Japanese nations, and was undermining the Jesuits' attempts at proselytization. The rulers of both countries took action against this phenomenon, with King Sebastian of Portugal banning the enslavement of Chinese and Japanese people in 1570, which seems to have been largely ignored, judging by future testimonies. On the other side, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, regent and de facto ruler of Japan, took a more drastic measure in 1587 by prohibiting the enslavement of his subjects and banning all Christian missionaries from the land. Quite hypocritically, he didn't have any moral qualms about selling off hundreds of captured Koreans as slaves after his invasion of the peninsula in 1592. In that same edict, Hideyoshi also banned official Jesuit missions and retook control of the city of Nagasaki from the Portuguese. Before the coming of the southern barbarians, Nagasaki was not the big and vibrant city of today, but a humble fishing village under the control of the Amura clan. That changed with the arrival of the Portuguese in Kyushu. The lord of the clan, Amura Sumitada, understood that the Europeans could prove valuable trade partners and allies in his wars against his much more powerful neighbours, so he quickly converted to Christianity, adopting the name Bartholomew, and offered land near Nagasaki to the Jesuits, where they would establish a permanent Christian quarter. Thanks to the trade activities, Nagasaki expanded rapidly, and in 1580, Don Bartholomew, as he had become known, granted the entire city to the Jesuits in perpetuity, in order to avoid it falling into the hands of his rival clan, Rizoji. As the years passed by, what was once a cluster of fishermen's huts became a buzzing port, housing 15,000 people by the end of the century, and serving as Portugal's base of operations in Japan, whether that was trade or the evangelism of the natives. Indeed, the city was a micrography of Portugal in the Far East. It was built in European fashion, with a church, a town hall, and houses painted in white, in accordance with Portuguese fashion. More importantly, the city's code of law was European in character, and the population was almost exclusively Christian. The city's prosperity continued even after the ownership of the land changed hands and returned to the Amura, but the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate would also bring the end of Portuguese activities in the land. In 1614, Jesuit missionaries were expelled, with Tokugawa authorities being far more zealous in this task than their Toyotomi predecessors, perhaps due to the shogun's greater anti-Christian sentiment. In 1639, as a response to the failed Shimabara rebellion, a revolt of Christian peasants in the south of Japan, the shogunate expelled the Portuguese merchants as well, bringing an end to a century of Iberian and Catholic presence in the land. However, the expulsion of the Portuguese and the Spanish and the beginning of sakoku, or national isolation, did not bring an end to all foreign presence in Japan. Following Tokugawa Iemitsu's harsh anti-Christian edicts of 1633, Portuguese traders were confined to the artificial island of Dejima, just off the coast of Nagasaki, until their expulsion. Dejima would not remain uninhabited for long, and soon it would house the employees of the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch arrived in Japan at the beginning of the century, with the first mission being the famous ship Liefde, which also carried the first Englishman to Japan, William Adams. Adams proved pivotal for the acquisition of trading rights on the Dutch's behalf, as he was on rather good terms with Tokugawa Ieyasu and convinced him that the Protestants would not spread their Christian views like the Catholics. So in 1609, the Dutch set up shop in Hirado, and enjoying relative freedom in their activities, were able to expand and grow their business rather quickly. 4 years later, competition arrived, as the British East India Company also set up a trading factory in the area. Contrary to the Dutch, the British endeavour resulted in an economic failure, and they abandoned their trading post just a decade later in A few years later, in 1641, the Dutch would also leave Hirado. though this was a forced relocation of their business by the shogunate, in an effort to save Nagasaki's failing economy as the Portuguese were no longer welcomed. The Dutch therefore became the sole Western traders in Japan, and would continue their enterprises through their factory in Dejima up until the mid-19th century, when Japan's borders were forcefully opened by Commodore Matthew Perry's armada. Though strictly controlled by shogunal authorities, trade was very lucrative for both sides. For Japan, Dejima wasn't just a place where imported goods came in, but also an eye to the outside world. Through the Dutch merchants, Japan, despite its isolation, was able to keep up with Western scientific, medical, and technological advancements. Being aware of these advancements was a key component in the rapid and successful industrialization of Japan during the Meiji era. So far, we have talked about Westerners visiting the land of the rising sun in the form of Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English traders and missionaries who arrived upon their black ships. It was easier for Western merchants to travel to Japan than for the Japanese to travel to Europe. This was due to the extensive network of trading posts that the European colonial powers had established across Asia, and their larger ships that were more suitable for ocean-faring missions. However, this didn't mean that the Japanese were not also willing to send their own representatives to these lands and learn more about these foreigners and their way of life. The first Japanese to have set foot on European soil was probably a man known as Bernardo the Japanese. He was one of the two disciples the Spanish missionary Francis Xavier took with him on a journey to Lisbon and then Rome. The other man, named Matthew, unfortunately never made it to Europe, as he died in India during their brief stop at Goa. After spending almost 4 years in Portugal and Italy, Bernardo passed away as well. Bernardo might have the honor of being the first, but he was just one man, visiting as a Jesuit trainee. In 1582, more of his countrymen would travel west in an official capacity, as the first Japanese embassy began its journey to meet the kings of Europe and the Pope. The Tensho Embassy, as it came to be known, was the brainchild of the Italian Jesuit Alessandro Valignano, who discussed the idea with the 3 Christian daimyos of Kyushu, Don Bartholomew, Arima Harinobu, and Otomo Sorin. Sorin was the most powerful of the 3, and therefore the head of the embassy, with the 12-year-old nobleman Ito Manchio representing him on the journey. Accompanying young Manchio were 3 other teenage boys, Miguel Chijiwa, Juliao Nakamura, and Matinho Hara. All of them, as you might have guessed by their names, were Christians, and in some way related to one of the 3 Christian daimyos. 2 years later, on the 11th of August 1584, the 4 Japanese teenagers and their custodians arrived in Lisbon, and following a brief sightseeing of the city's wonders, they continued their journey to Spain. In Madrid, they met with King Philip II, who recently had also received the Portuguese crown, making him arguably the most powerful man in Europe. They also visited the Escorial and the University of Alcalá. After a little tour of Spain, they embarked on a ship that brought them to Tuscany, the land of Francesco de' Medici. In Pisa, they personally met the Grand Duke, who showed great interest in them. After lodging for a few days in Firenze, they moved southwards towards the climax of their journey to Rome. Their meeting with the head of the Holy See was almost like a Roman triumph. Dressed in their traditional kimonos, riding on their black steeds, and accompanied by a regiment of Swiss guards, they marched through the streets of the Eternal City towards the Vatican Hill. Bells heralded their procession, and as they approached Castel Sant'Angelo, the cannons of the fort fired a salute. The Pope welcomed them very warmly, as he was quite interested in the missionary work of the Jesuits in Japan. The teenage ambassadors were also able to witness one of the Catholic Church's rarest occasions, the Papal Conclave, as the already bad health of Pope Gregory XII declined rapidly, and the pontifex passed on the 10th of April 1585. Gregory's successor, Sixtus V, also met with the Japanese youths and welcomed the boys into the ranks of European nobility by making them knights of the Order of the Golden Spur. In June, the young men left Rome and toured Italy for a while, visiting Venice, Padua, Verona, Milan, and Genoa, before returning to Spain and Portugal to make their way back to Japan. During their entire journey, they were carefully guided by the Jesuits so as not to see anything embarrassing, or anything that could lead them to form a bad opinion about Catholic Europe, as Valignano wanted to use the boys' stories for propaganda purposes back in Japan. It was necessary for the Jesuits that the accounts of these boys upon their return confirmed the spiritual and cultural superiority of Catholic Europe. The Europeans, for their part, were quite enchanted by the Japanese mission. Suddenly, everyone was interested in Japan, and the sending of envoys was discussed among various circles, not just in Catholic Iberia and Italy where they had visited, but in France, Germany, and even Poland. But while Europe was experiencing a frenzy over Japan, back in the land of the rising sun, everything had changed. When the 4 ambassadors, now grown men, arrived back in their homeland on the 21st of July 1590, they found a land hostile to Christianity. While Oda Nobunaga was friendly towards Christian missionaries, or at least tolerated them, his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, had decreed that Japan was the land of the kami, not the Christian god. But even his anti-Christian stance would not be as bad as Tokugawa's, who systematically hunted down Christian converts. By the time of the first general persecution, launched by Ieyasu in 1613, the 4 men had become Jesuit padres, and Manchio had already passed away due to illness the year prior. Machinho was forced into exile in 1614 and lived the rest of his days in Macau until his death in 1629. 4 years later, Juliao would become a martyr in Nagasaki. In the same year, Miguel died too, having abandoned the Jesuits and Christianity before 1603, though recent evidence suggests he might have been a crypto-Christian or reconverted on his deathbed. But as the Tokugawa regime was turning increasingly hostile towards Christianity, another ambassador was sent to Rome. His name was Hasekura Tsunenaga, a samurai in the service of the daimyo of Sendai, Date Masamune. Contrary to the former Tensho embassy, Tsunenaga followed a different route, first sailing to the Americas and New Spain, and then making his way to Europe to meet with the Spanish crown and the Pope. Because the Japanese vessels of the time were not suitable for transoceanic travel, a galleon in the European fashion was made. Named San Juan Bautista, the ship set sail on the 28th of October 1613 for Acapulco, with more than 100 Japanese on board. These included samurai, merchants, and servants who accompanied Tsunenaga. After spending a few days in Mexico City, the procession continued to Veracruz, from where they sailed to Europe, making a small stop in Cuba. Tsunenaga arrived in Sevilla on the 23rd of October 1614, almost a year after he had begun his journey. On the 30th of January of the following year, he was granted an audience with King Philip III, to whom Tsunenaga presented a letter from his lord Masamune, who requested a trade agreement and Spanish missionaries to preach in his domain. To sweeten the deal even more, and to showcase the sincerity of his lord's words, which more or less went opposite to the regime's stance on Christianity, Tsunenaga agreed to be baptized on the 17th of February. Having secured some vague promises from Philip, the entourage continued for Rome, while making a forced stop at the French city of Saint-Tropez due to bad weather. But finally, on the 3rd of November, Tsunenaga, now also called Felipe, was able to meet Pope Paul V. Once more, Tsunenaga presented a letter written by his lord, this time addressed to the Pontifex, asking for Franciscan missionaries to intervene for a trade agreement between Spain and Japan. Just like Philip, the Pope, who by that time had heard of the news of the Christian persecutions in Japan, gave no meaningful reply. Tsunenaga was forced to return to Spain, where after some time he received King Philip's official reply in the form of a letter. The Spanish monarch was friendly towards Date Masamune, but there was no mention of a trade agreement, only a pledge of support for the Catholic faith. Essentially, King Philip was sending his thoughts and prayers. Defeated, Tsunenaga embarked on the return journey to Japan following the same route, albeit taking a little detour in the end and visiting the Spanish governor of the Philippines in 1618. When he arrived in Nagasaki 2 years later, Tsunenaga found a completely different Japan. What was once suspicions had turned into open hostility against the Christians. Even his own lord, Masamune, who once was open and friendly towards the missionaries and the new religion they preached, was now executing them to appease the Shogun. His 7-year-long journey to bridge Japan and Spain had been for nothing. 2 years later, Tsunenaga passed away. Following Tsunenaga, no other Japanese ambassador would visit Europe until the 19th century, when in 1862 the Tokugawa shogunate sent an official embassy across many European nations. Japan would enter 2 centuries of isolation, with the only outside contact being the port of Nagasaki, until US President Millard Fillmore tasked Commodore Matthew Perry to open Japan to trade, even with the force of guns if necessary. More videos on the culture, society, military and religion of Warring States and Edo-era Japan are on the way. To ensure you don't miss it, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.